Chapter 5, the American Revolution. The English Empire of Great Britain, at peace for the first time in nearly 50 years, turned its focus in 1763 toward organizing its empire. To pay its wartime debts, England turned to the colonies to foot the bill, ending decades of an idea known as salutary neglect. The colonies were largely left to their own devices. King George III ascended the throne, the royal throne, at an unfortunate moment. He was determined to reassert the power of the British monarchy, and he was also legitimately mentally unstable. His prime minister, too, was a hardliner who wanted to place the colonies fully under English control. The king, the prime minister, and the government of England proceeded to issue a series of proclamations and laws designed to bring the colonies to heel. At first, the policies were difficult to protest. Soon, though, colonists began to rally around their distrust of Mother England. Merchants suffered from the increases in taxation, trappers were hemmed in by restricted land movements, and with the institution of permanent troop presence in the colonies, ordinary colonists came face to face with English power personified by lockstep redcoat soldiers, redcoats, English soldiers. Accustomed to a wide latitude when it came to colonial policies, especially taxes, the British challenged the foundation of colonial political power after the French and Indian War. The sudden hardening of British policies and resulting flare-ups of colonial resistance brought on a series of events that would unravel the mighty British Empire. The aforementioned Proclamation of 1763, I mentioned in a previous chapter, it failed when the English failed to enforce the policy, despite fear such movements might restart a continental conflict with native peoples. The Mutiny Act of 1765, Mutiny Act, cemented a permanent British troop presence in the colonies. The Sugar Act and Currency Acts of 1764, increased sugar taxes and made it illegal to issue currency in the colonies. And with the incredible Stamp Act of 1765, the Stamp Act of 1765, it placed an unprecedented tax on literally every piece of paper, books, newspapers, maps, legal documents, printed and sold in the colonies, which multiplied the colonial tax burden tenfold. Where earlier taxes had only touched on imports and exports, the Stamp Act was levied directly on commerce and business, contained exclusively to the colonies. Colonial assemblies, which had not been consulted, immediately balked at the concept of no taxation without representation in the English Parliament. This is quite a break from this period of salutary neglect, where the colonial assemblies were free to sort of govern internal processes, things like an internal tax. Patrick Henry protested the tax. He belongs up here, Patrick Henry. And ordinary Americans boycotted British goods or stopped purchasing them directly in an effort to apply economic pressure against the tax until the law was overturned in 1766. That is the Stamp Act. The conflict playing out between England and her colonies was not only a war of words and dollars. Fighting between British troops on the docks of Boston and American dock workers was frequent. On March 5th, 1770, troops at the Boston Customs House, protecting the house, under a hail of snowballs and rocks from angry Bostonians, angry at an internal tax, fired on and killed 5 civilians. An accident, generally understood as an accident, the Boston Massacre, as it became to be known, was the event, an event that played into the hands of those patriots hostile to British control, and it was quickly propagandized by those forces. Paul Revere and Sam Adams, famous names here, emerged as early leaders of the separatist movement within the colonies. Both men worked hard to keep the anti-tax protests alive, and a spirit of dissent spread slowly throughout the colonies due to the deliberate actions of a loose confederacy of like-minded colonists. The philosophy of colonial revolt was a product of the times, made possible only by repeated abuses of power by the British government. The people of the colonies had carved a civilization from the wilderness, and they expected their government to be responsive to their unique needs. The English Constitution, meanwhile, was largely unwritten and rooted in precedent and established in an older era of kings. As King George III targeted the colonies with new taxes and policies, colonists understood they were being treated differently than their English subjects at home, and they demanded political representation, an idea foreign to the English who enjoyed only virtual representation at home. The taverns of the colonies became places where colonists could voice political dissent, and pamphlets were written, published, and distributed all across the northern and southern colonies. Taverns. Colonial taverns were a place where these ideas could be spread. What if we fought back? What if we demanded political representation, etc.? Despite brewing discontent, the English passed the Tea Act of 1773, again, 7-8 years after some of these earlier acts that were rejected. This gave the East India Company permission to sell its tea tax-free in the colonies, which undercut existing American tea merchants who still had to pay the tax, resulting boycotts of tea, led by the revolutionary group, the Daughters of Liberty. I got to put them on here. Daughters of Liberty. I'd put revolutionaries, men and women. Daughters of Liberty sprung up across the colonial seaboard and stood as the first real unified political act of the colonies. As East India Company tea shipments landed in Boston later that year in 1763, 150 men dressed up as Mohawk Indians broke onto the ships and dumped the tea into the Boston harbor at the Boston Tea Party. One of dozens of such tea parties that was held along the coast within those intervening months. A revolutionary generation of free blacks and slaves also found hope in the message and spirit of liberty gaining traction across the colonies. Revolutionary generations. These weren't just contained to American elites seeking a political revolution necessarily. These ideas were bubbling up all across the colonies. After the shock of the anarchy of the Boston Tea Party and tea parties across the country, a vindictive English Parliament passed a series of coercive acts designed to punish the colonies and targeting specifically the separatist hotbed of Massachusetts. But this backfired badly. The other colonies rallied around Massachusetts and began a widespread boycott of British goods beyond tea that further unified these disparate peoples in disparate places who formerly had come to the colonies not to be one people, but to be different peoples. They were becoming one. Disgruntled, not yet revolutionary, representatives of the individual colonies met at the First Continental or Colonial Congress in September of 1774, and they made 5 important decisions that we are here at the First Colonial Continental Congress. So, during all of this, no one has solidified a notion of separatism yet, just resistance. The First Continental Congress rejected a weak form of colonial union under British rule. They passed a moderate statement of grievances against English aggressions. They backed defensive military preparations in Massachusetts. They instituted a formal boycott of British goods and established a Continental Association to see their decrees made public and acted upon. And then finally, 5, they agreed to meet as a second Colonial or Continental Congress the following spring. So no one is clamoring for revolution yet, but they are aggrieved and they are going to codify their grievances and publish them. Aware that colonial animosity was strengthening, the English Parliament, for their part, considered and passed a series of conciliatory propositions in early 1775. But news of these English concessions would not arrive in the colonies until after the first shots of the Revolutionary War were fired. After the First Continental Congress had concluded, the Minutemen of Massachusetts, where are you at? Minutemen, prepared for a defensive war at the conflict's flashpoint. When British soldiers sought the arrest of revolutionary agitators Sam Adams and John Hancock outside of Boston, Paul Revere and William Dawes rode out to warn colonists ahead of the British march to Lexington and Concord. And the British soldiers and colonists traded fire all along the route as they looked for these guys. Only a handful of people died on each side, but the bloody incident was added to the narrative of British atrocities begun at that Boston Massacre. These shots between the world's most powerful empire and her diminutive colonies were heard round the world. Shots heard around the world. And the war between the colonies and England had begun. 2 conflicts now consumed the colonies beginning in April of 1775, the military conflict with Great Britain and the political conflict happening inside the colonies. The military conflict was savage, pitting the civilian population against powerful troops of the British Empire in a new kind of war, a revolution for liberation against an oppressive empire. That's why it's heard around the world. Simultaneously, colonists set about sewing together an independent nation from an assembly of distinct colonies. They had to hastily fashion agreements on whether to demand independence from Great Britain, on how to structure their new country, on how to deal with questions that the Revolution had raised about slavery, the rights of Native peoples, the role of women, and the limits of religious tolerance. Though some colonists had been agitating for revolution for years, most colonists, most people were generally unprepared for war, not to mention the questions such a conflict for liberty would raise. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, when the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, nascent capital of liberty, delegates agreed to support the war, but they disagreed about its purpose. Some still hoped for reconciliation with Great Britain. I can't leave that point unchallenged. Many people still wanted to find a way to reunite with Great Britain. Most colonists believed they were simply fighting a war for a redress of grievances against the first years of the war. But they changed their minds when the British recruited Indians, African slaves, and German mercenaries to their cause, and then blocked their colonial ports. Total colonial independence became the only option for those fighting the war, an argument articulated in Thomas Paine's Common Sense pamphlet, famous pamphlet that circulated throughout the colonies, which advocated for a complete break from the British political system entirely. He made it very plausible. He made it seem like it was just that, common sense. They had no other option. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress approved the powerful and inspiring Declaration of Independence. Please go read it. Written by Thomas Jefferson, and the colonies began to reconstitute themselves as individual states entirely separate from Great Britain. By 1781, most states had written their own state constitutions, and the Congress adopted a plan for a union of these new states under their first government called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation gave the new nation pretty limited powers, and it did not authorize for the collection of taxes, for instance. So the new government of the United States of America, lowercase u, borrowed money from other nations to fund its war against the British. The fledgling nation also had a tough time recruiting soldiers, so the new Congress created a continental army with a single commander in charge, General George Washington. These new Americans in the colonies had some military advantages over their better equipped and better trained British military. They were fighting at home, they were more committed to the conflict, and they received support from abroad, namely those who wished to see the British Empire topple. Still, only British miscalculations and the transformation of the war actually gave the colonies a fighting chance. I'll be brief. The war can be broken into three distinct phases. Between 75 and 76, what we'll have is the New England phase. 1, 2, 3. Here we go. Okay. So in that New England phase, radical revolutionaries fought the British, the German Hessian soldiers, and sympathetic colonial loyalists. They fought against their own countrymen. Those in favor of continued British colonial rule, those colonists still in favor of it, in and around Boston and into Nova Scotia, while establishing a unified colonial front. George Washington's famous crossing of the Delaware, go look up that painting. That maneuver gave the Continental Army much needed supplies and a morale boost following early setbacks in the conflict with the British, the crossing of the Delaware here. That's the first phase, the New England phase. In the Mid-Atlantic phase, MA, we are 76 through 78, 1776 through 1778. In this phase, the British tried to divide and conquer the colonists, and they chased General Washington and his army all over the Northeast, with 2,500 of his soldiers dying from illness and exposure during one winter at Valley Forge alone. Many tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy who had decided to back the British in this conflict fled to Canada after mounting losses against the revolutionaries. The American victory at Saratoga, New York, assured the French of an impending American victory, and France provided formal diplomatic and financial recognition of the new American nation. Shaken, the Prime Minister of Great Britain offered complete home rule. Home rule was offered in the second phase to the Americans if they would quit the war effort and remain under the British banner. In the final southern phase, which ended in 1781 through 1781, the British attempted to turn the loyalist or the Tory sentiment in its southern colonies among the colonists into an insurrection against the Northern revolutionaries, and even hoped that slaves would be loyal and rally to the British cause. That strategy failed. The revolutionaries blended into the civilian population across the South, and the loyalist or Tory sentiment in the South was weaker than expected. With the military support from the French on land and at sea bearing down on the British, General Cornwallis surrendered his 7,000 British troops while an American band played "The World Turned Upside Down." Just a few years of war, 3 phases, and the world has changed forever. The political fallout was significant in England. The prime minister quit and another one succeeded him. British dignitaries met with American diplomats, Ben Franklin and John Adams, etc., in France to discuss the terms of peace. Ben Franklin was an adept negotiator, and he got a preliminary treaty signed quickly. The final treaty ceded the colonies from Canada to North Florida, and the last of the British armed forces soon shipped out of New York. I mentioned them previously. Up to 1/3 of American colonists remained loyal to the British during the war. And these loyalists, or Tories, as they're sometimes called, faced harassment in the months after the war's end. At least 100,000 of these loyalists fled to Canada after the war, creating English-speaking Quebec, and many others simply returned home to England. Religions had winners out of the American Revolution: Protestants, Baptists, and Catholics who supported the Patriots, and losers, including the pacifist Quakers and the British Anglican Church in the United States, lowercase u. The revolution weakened many Native Americans who had largely backed the British during the war, as colonists had been and would continue to be the principal aggressors in conflict over Indian lands. The Roman Vatican, for their part, provided the United States with a Catholic bishop after the war and had ended and formally recognized the legitimacy of the new country. American slaves, as I had mentioned, the revolutionary generation, were undoubtedly exposed to the ideology of revolution during the war. Though white support for slavery in the South survived this rebirth of liberty on the American continent. In much of the North, by contrast, the combination of revolutionary rhetoric and evangelical Christian fervor helped spread the anti-slavery sentiment across New England. Abolitionists, those opposed to slavery, wanted to get rid of it or abolish it, first attacked the slave trade, then laws that made freeing slaves illegal, and then the legality of African slavery itself, state by state across the North. Obvious tensions between the nation's commitment to individual liberty and the widespread use of slave labor in the nation's southern economy became increasingly evident. In a half measure, every state but Georgia and South Carolina came to prohibit the further importation of African slaves from abroad. The fight for liberty led some Americans to free their slaves, an act called manumission. And most of the new northern states soon passed gradual emancipation laws to free those who were still enslaved. The nation's commitment to the ideals of liberty, too, struck many women as antithetical to their own plight. Free white women possessed no voting rights, no property rights, and no ability to initiate a divorce, even as they became important incubators of so-called Republican values to future generations, and despite their own wartime support and sacrifices, think Daughters of Liberty. Americans certainly agreed that they would institute a republican form of government in their new nation, where their elected representatives would only act with the consent of the governed. They would aspire toward an equality of opportunity, though no equality of condition. Their ideological aspirations and experiment in statecraft became a model for other nations who too sought to overthrow the empires, the chains of empire, and began the hard work of instituting democratic self-government. The most basic decision that states made was to draft original constitutions. Americans believed that the vagueness of the English unwritten constitution had been the source of much corruption. The second decision was that the power of the executive had to be severely limited. Yet only one house was often popularly elected, and property requirements still prevented most people from voting. Many state constitutions, however, were written by special conventions so that legislators could not abuse their granted powers. Though governors became powerful over time, they remained popularly elected. In Virginia, the Statute of Religious Liberty, written by Thomas Jefferson, called for a separation of church and state. Other states took notice, and the preferential treatment given to certain Christian faiths and denominations upon the founding of those original colonies faded from among the state governments. Slavery survived in the Deep South and border states for 3 reasons. Most whites assumed the inferiority of blacks. Southern whites had incredible sums of money invested in their slaves. And 3, even forward-looking people, including General Washington and Thomas Jefferson, failed to envision a future without slavery. Few whites believed blacks could be integrated into American society as equals, and so the cause of freedom in the aftermath of the War for Liberty and Independence did not extend to the enslaved. These new state governments, which relied on increased taxation to pay their war debts, now faced mobs of distressed farmers throughout New England. Daniel Shays, a former captain in the Revolutionary Army under Washington, issued a set of demands that included the printing of paper money, tax relief, and the abolition of debtors' prison. Shays' rebellion failed, but added urgency to the movement to produce a new national constitution powerful enough to survive ideological and military challenge from within. The aforementioned Articles of Confederation, which existed from 1781 through 1789, they were a governing document. They proved insufficient. They formally united the colonies as independent sovereign nations, states, but differences among the colonies became evident early after the Republic's birth. The Articles did not provide the authority to regulate trade, draft troops, or levy taxes directly. There was no separate executive branch. The 9 states, each holding 1 vote, had to authorize a law, and all 13 state legislatures were required to amend the Articles themselves. So you needed 9 of 13 to pass a law, and all 13 to make any changes to the Articles. The lasting success of the Confederation undoubtedly were the ordinances of 1784 and 1785, which divided the Western Continental Territories up and unified the way that land was surveyed and sold. And it gave territories a clear path toward achieving independent statehood in the United States. Diplomatic failures with Great Britain and Spain after the war, and the Confederation's inability to pay off its enormous post-war debts to her own soldiers, to other nations, etc., offer an immediate example of the shortcomings of the loose Confederation system under the Articles. A stronger form of government would be needed, many agreed, to match the ideals and the potential of the new United States. Historians have long argued over the causes and the character of the American Revolution. Was the revolution caused by British imperial policy or by internal tensions within the colonies? Were colonists primarily motivated by constitutional principles, ideals of equality, or economic self-interest? Was the revolution radical or conservative common sense, as Paine put it? But such questions are hardly limited to historians. From Abraham Lincoln's use of the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address to the 21st century Tea Party members wearing knee breeches, the revolution has remained at the center of American political culture. Indeed, how one understands the revolution often dictates or determines how one defines what it means to be an American. The revolution was not won by a few founding fathers. Men and women across all ranks of American society contributed to the colony's most improbable victory. From commoners who protested the Stamp Act to the women who helped organize boycotts against the Townshend duties. From the men, both black and white, who fought in the Continental Army to the women who contributed to its support. The revolution, however, did not aim to end all social and civic inequalities in the new country, and in the case of Native Americans, it created new inequalities. But over time, the revolution's rhetoric of equality and liberty, as encapsulated in the Declaration of Independence, helped highlight some of those inequalities, and it became a shared global aspiration for future social and political movements for hundreds and hundreds of years.